So basic shrubs. People will often ask is, do they have to all be evergreen? Well, they don't. When you're choosing plants, I think you want to look for at least a backdrop of evergreen plants because you need something in your front landscape that is there 24/7. But deciduous plants, which are those that lose their leaves, those can work in the landscape, can give you some seasonality, some flow. In my opinion, a good landscape should be evergreens, deciduous, perennials, annuals. You want a lot of diversity in that landscape because it makes it interesting. Now, I think one of the most important questions you can ask is how large does that plant need to be at maturity? They all look cute in a 1-gallon pot, and then you plant them and they grow up and cover up the house. So read the tag that comes with the plants. Occasionally the plants haven't read their own tags and get larger, but if you start off knowing the mature size, and we're not talking just height, you also need to know spread. I think many people plant their landscape plants way too close to the foundation of the house, and you're not allowing them that natural spread. So they're right next to the house, and so all of a sudden they're putting all of their growth to one side, which makes them somewhat top heavy, and they lean and they're just not as attractive as they could be. Know the environmental limitations of your yard, not your neighborhood or your county or your state, but do you have a spot that water stands in? Is there an area that the wind just whips through all the time? Are you trying to screen something or do you want to enhance a view? So work with the parameters that you are given. If you love hostas and shade plants and you have not a tree in your yard, that's not a good mix. So you do want to work with the environment that you're given. And sometimes Mother Nature throws a curveball at us and we go from a deep shade yard to a full sun because we lose the trees. And then we have to adapt and change things that are going to work. Does the plant have any serious pest problems that we know about now? Let's think about hybrid tea roses. If you plant those, you know that you have to spray because they will get black spot disease. Then things like red top photinias. That was the #1 hedge that we used in the South for 30 or more years, and we don't recommend it anymore because they get a leaf spot disease and nobody wants to spray a 100-foot hedge every week. Leyland cypress are trees that were very commonly used, but they can get a stem canker and we end up losing a branch here and a branch there. So if you start off with a bulletproof plant or what we think is bulletproof, then it might make that maintenance easier. We are often asked, what can we plant that will bloom 12 months out of the year that we don't have to water, prune, or fertilize? While there is no such beast, you can choose plants that fit the size of your landscape, work with the parameters that you're given, and that will make your job a whole lot easier to maintain them. And then the last feature we're looking at is color. And I love color. So we can achieve that with flowers, with foliage, with berries, and even with bark. Think about a crepe myrtle. The bark on that tree can be as pretty in the winter as the flowers are in the summer or the fall foliage is in the fall. Okay, we're not going to cover every plant that you could possibly grow in Arkansas, and that is going to be true on every single one of the topics we do in the course of these 5 weeks. We're going to give you an overview, and so we're going to kind of cover some plants that are probably the more common ones that you're going to run into. So let's start with evergreen shrubs, and I would say that all of you probably have at least 1 holly and 1 azalea in your landscape. Those are the top 2 landscape plants grown in Arkansas. Now, in the family of hollies, the Latin name there, the genus is Ilex, I-L-E-X. There are over 300 species and thousands of cultivars, and they're releasing new varieties all the time. So you're not going to have every kind of holly that could possibly grow. But in the holly genus, it's pretty diverse. We've got plants that are as short as maybe 8 to 10 inches. And we have some that are trees that can be 50 to 60 feet tall. We have some that they're spread like the sky pencil or skyrocket holly that grow like a telephone pole straight up and down. And we have others that can have a 20 to 30 foot spread. So again, knowing the mature size is very important. Now, you look at this word right here called dioecious. And that's one of the things that I'm always telling folks when we're talking about gardening. There's a lot of terminology, but there isn't anything you do, whether it's cooking, whether it's golf, whether it's tennis, you've got to know the lingo. And so if there are words that come up and you don't know what they are, ask questions, and that way you'll understand it a whole lot better. But dioecious means that we have a separate male plant and a separate female plant. So the flowers are needed from both in order to have berries. And you'll look in these two pictures, and the one here at the top, you can see these are stamens. So this is the male. Those are the pollen parts. Those are the stamens of a male. And then down here you can see we've kind of got that center ovary in the center, which is the female. Only the female hollies will have berries. The male plants are needed for pollination, but they will not set fruit. Also, many of the dwarf varieties, things like dwarf helleri, dwarf yaupon, they never flower or set fruit, so it really doesn't matter if they're male or female. Now, how do you know the difference? Well, you can tell when they're in bloom. You may know by the name of the variety. In the realm of deciduous hollies, there's ones called Berry Poppins, and then there's one that's Mr. Poppins. There's Blue Boy and Blue Girl. So there are some different names out there. But you could also buy a plant with a berry on it, and you would know that you have a female. Do you have to have both male and female in your own yard? Not necessarily. As I mentioned, hollies are ubiquitous in the landscapes. So if you live in a neighborhood, chances are there are hollies growing nearby, and bees can transfer that pollen from plant to plant. If you live out in the country, kind of in an isolated area, then one male plant for about every 8 to 10 female plants to ensure good berry set. Hollies will grow in full sun to total shade. If we had a hedge from one side of the yard to the other, starting in full sun and ending in total shade, we would not have uniform growth. Those that are in full sun are going to be much denser. They're going to grow faster and taller. Those in the shade will be a little bit slower and more open due to the lack of sunlight and photosynthesis. So we have a lot of different hollies. We're not going to talk about 300 species. We're going to talk about some of the more common ones that you're going to see. The Foster holly group, the Chinese holly, the Japanese holly, yaupon hollies, and deciduous hollies. And again, look at the Latin name down here at the bottom, Ilex crenata. So Ilex means holly, crenata means the Japanese hollies, and pagoda is the cultivar in that family. And that's what you're looking at right here. Okay, the Foster holly. These are plants that tend to be taller and not as widespreading. So they could be a great corner or foundation planting, but they can also be used as a screen or a hedge. Now, depending on the density you want of your hedge will determine how far apart you plant them. If you've got a large yard and you have room for a double planting, you could actually put one row towards the back and plant those about 6 to 8 feet apart, and then zigzag in front of that 6 feet out, and then go another 6 to 8 feet apart, and that will give you a much denser full hedge. If you don't have that much space, you can plant them a little bit closer together in one row and then just let the canopies merge together. You do not have to have a single profile for each individual plant. But these plants will grow tall. If you look at this bottom plant here, you can see it will have branches all the way to the ground, all the way to the top. If we want it to be like a small tree, we can actually limb that up and remove these branches and just expose the main trunk and tree form it. Now, once that's done, it is not going to stay that way for life. These are broadleaf plants, and so they will have dormant buds on them that will leaf out. So about once a year or so, you're going to have to go in and do some cleanup. They're often sold in these very pyramidal growth habits, more of a Christmas tree kind of shape. If you want them to keep that shape, you can do that. If you look down here, there are some tiny thorns on these leaves. They're not deadly thorns, but they are thorny, and they do have good berries on them as well. The thorniest of all of the hollies is going to be the Chinese holly. Now, Chinese holly has a lot more thorns than you're seeing in this picture, but this is a selection of the Chinese holly. So this is Ilex cornuta by itself. That is the Chinese holly. Burford is the variety or the selection or the cultivar of that. Now, this is not a small plant at maturity. It can easily get 15 to 20 feet tall and have a 15 to 20 foot spread. It's a fast growing plant, but you would not want that as a foundation planting. Now, a great example, I had a friend once that was putting in a new landscape, and he had the windows, that are about a foot off the ground, which makes landscaping difficult. I pulled up in front of the house, and he was planting a red top photinia in front of that 1 foot high window. And I said, do you realize how tall that plant's going to get? And he said, oh, that's fine. They were on sale and I can keep them pruned. You don't want to be out there constantly pruning. Don't plant this as a foundation planting. Use this more as a hedge. Now, there is a dwarf Burford holly. The dwarf Burford holly, when we hear that word dwarf, we immediately assume tiny plant. This thing can get 6 feet tall at maturity, but it's much slower growing. And if you look at this, it just has one thorn on the very tip of the leaf. A typical Chinese holly will have thorns all the way around it. If you look at this one over here on the left-hand side, notice the yellowing that we see in the foliage. That could be an indication where it needs more nitrogen, or maybe the drainage is not good. There's a lot of reasons that plants struggle. But if I were looking at that plant and I knew the soil drainage was okay, look at the amount of berries on this plant versus the amount of berries on this plant. And sometimes a plant will set a copious amount of fruit. And what is the reason for a flower? To set a seed. So if we have all of the energy of that plant going into seed production, into the berries, it's pulling some of that nutrition away from the rest of the foliage. So that could be a reason why it's a little bit on the yellow side. We could give it some fertilizer. It could bounce back, green up a little bit. But it also might be that after this season and the berries get taken off by the birds, next year you may not have as many fruit, because sometimes they're alternate bearing. They'll go from one season to the next. The Nellie R. Stevens holly is a hybrid. A hybrid means we've got parents from both sides. So it comes from the Chinese holly and the American holly, and it's a very fast growing hedge. And if you look at that hedge in this picture, you can't see where one plant starts and the other one ends. And that's what we're looking for with a hedge. We want it to all kind of blend together and take that shape. Now remember, and we're going to talk about that more when we talk about pruning in a few weeks, but when we're doing a hedge, we want the top angle of that hedge to be a little bit narrower than the base to allow sunlight the full length of that plant. Look again, here we have a nice solid hedge. Down here you can see more definition of the individual plants. So if you want it to look like individual plants, you can. They do kind of keep that natural pyramidal shape on their own, but you could also eventually let those grow together, and this could begin to look like this. So it's basically a living fence. Give this one room to grow. Again, it's probably not a great foundation planting because of the mature height. Now, the Japanese hollies are small leafed plants, and a lot of folks think they have a boxwood when they see a leaf like this, because they assume that all hollies have thorns, and all hollies do not have thorns. In fact, a lot of the ones we use very commonly do not. So in the Japanese holly family, probably the two that are most popular are the compacta hollies, which you see here, and also the Helleri holly, which can be a substitute for a yaupon. So very small leaves, kind of a cup shape to that leaf. But when you think compact, again, we think small. Well, the compacta holly can get 5 to 6 feet in height, but in 20 years it can be 10 feet wide. But the difference between a holly and a boxwood is also the density of the growth. A boxwood tends to keep all of its foliage on the outer edge, while the hollies have a lot of that growth on the interior. So these can tolerate trimming very well. If they do set fruit, which many of the small leaf varieties do not, if they do set fruit, the flowers are going to be the same as any other holly, but the berries will be black at maturity, not red. These are some other varieties of Chinese or Japanese hollies. We've got the compacta there at the top. This one is called Soft Touch. This is probably the smallest mature holly that we have. In fact, a lot of folks are growing these in their fairy gardens. So Soft Touch only gets about 18 inches tall at maturity. Sky Pencil, and there's another one called Sky Rocket. These are varieties that will get some height to it, eventually up to 6 feet in height, but they stay very, very narrow. Now, I think when you plant them out in the landscape, they look a bit odd. But if you're doing a container and you need something that's that thriller, you need something that's tall and vertical, these work really well. They are evergreen year-round, and this is something you could also use to do some kind of a spiral or topiary if you want to. Now, the Yaupon holly, Ilex vomitoria, if you eat it, you're going to throw up. This is a plant that is native to South Arkansas. You will see them growing out in the woods. Both of these plants that you see in this picture are Yaupon hollies. The tall one in the center is our standard Yaupon, and that one, the females do produce good berries. And the ones that are low growing around it are the dwarf Yaupon hollies. And they are often the fillers in the landscape. We often call them the meatball look. But you don't have to have each individual round ball there. They can all grow together like you're seeing them do here. They are adapted statewide. They will tolerate wet and dry conditions. So it's probably the most versatile of the hollies that we do grow. And that's why we see it so common. Now here's a different, you can kind of see the difference between a Yaupon or a holly leaf and a boxwood leaf. If you look at the leaf margin, like John was talking about earlier, we have this scalloped edge to it. So the scalloped edge is nice because that shows us that we're a holly. If you look over here at this boxwood, it has a smooth or entire edge to it. So this means that we're looking at a boxwood, and this means we're looking at a holly. So I've been in so many landscapes over the years where people say, my boxwoods are doing such and such, and they're not boxwoods, but they're hollies. Now, this is what I'm calling the meatball look, when we have those individual balls. And you'll see a lot of people every year in the spring, they get their electric hedge trimmers, and every landscape plant in the yard, they take and form these perfect little meatballs. I think that looks a little unusual. It's not as natural. I would much prefer, especially on this right-hand side, that we would just allow those to grow together, maybe do a little shearing at the top or on the sides, but that would be a small little hedge leading its way in. Now, if your entire yard is dwarf Yaupon hollies, it is not too exciting because it's just green, and it's green year-round. But putting that as a backdrop works really well, and that can offset deciduous shrubs in front of it or flowers and perennials. So I do think it's a good versatile plant, but don't just have that by itself. Now, the deciduous hollies add a whole new dimension to our landscapes. They look very similar to just a green shrub during the growing season, but in the fall of the year, they drop their leaves and they are left behind with these fabulous berries if they're females. Now, there are varieties with red berries, with orange berries, and with yellow berries. These are what we see dotting the roadsides as we travel the interstates in the winter months. So it can add a lot of color. There are two basic species of deciduous hollies. The one on the left has a much coarser textured foliage, and in my opinion is probably not as attractive during the growing season, and that is Ilex verticillata. The one on the right looks very much like our Yaupon holly. It has that small scalloped edge leaf, and it's much thinner in texture though because it is deciduous and not evergreen. So Ilex decidua does not set as much fruit as Ilex verticillata, but they're both available in our local garden centers and nurseries. The more sunlight, the better berry production you're going to get. You know, I did mention earlier that you can grow hollies in deep shade, but they will never flower or set fruit. Okay, moving on, this is the other group of plants that we see a lot of. And keep in mind that all azaleas are rhododendrons, but not all rhododendrons are azaleas. So azaleas, the Latin name is Rhododendron indica or Rhododendron satsuki or whatever it is. Rhododendron is going to be the genus. But as a common name, most of us in the South call them azaleas. And if it's the larger growing, almost tree-like plant with large balls of flowers, we call those rhododendrons. But they are cousins. One of them, rhododendrons, likes much cooler climates than the South. And azaleas tend to like the more heat-loving plants in the South. So if you travel a lot, you're going to see a lot more azaleas in southern climates and very few rhododendrons. And if you go up north, you're going to see a lot more rhododendrons and very few azaleas because they're not as winter hardy. But both can grow in our gardens here in Arkansas. I will tell you, we do a lot better with azaleas than we do with rhododendrons, but there are new varieties now that are southern grown rhododendrons. And so they're coming from climates similar to ours and will do better. I do have both in my landscape, but if I were planting them in the yard, I would plant azaleas spring through early summer, avoid fall planting, and I would plant rhododendrons fall through early winter. Those are their happy seasons. So the main criteria for both of them is they do need a very well-drained soil, they like acidity, and they're going to do best where they have some protection from the hottest afternoon sun. Now, with the azalea world, there are thousands and thousands of varieties, and these are named varieties that have been registered. There are many more than that that are just seedlings that have come up in people's yards. Look at even the different shapes of flowers. So we've got single blooms, we've got double blooms, we've got strap-shaped flowers, we've got rounded ones. Typically with our evergreen azaleas, we're talking in terms of reds, pinks, purples, and whites. Now there can be some bicolors, there can even be some variegated foliage now, but the majority of the colors we're going to see in the evergreens are going to be in those range of colors. Look at the mature size of these plants as well. Just like we mentioned with hollies, we've got the southern indicas of azaleas that can grow up to 8 to 10 feet tall. And then we've got some very dwarf ones like gumpos that get no taller than about a foot. So know the mature size of the plants that you're putting in. We can grow any variety of azalea from central Arkansas south. If you live in the northern tier, you are going to be a little bit more limited. The southern indicas do not do as well for you, and then some of the other of the reblooming types, we've got just limited availability as well. If you look at these pictures, the white ones and the light pink ones, this time of year in the fall, we often start to see them losing their foliage, and they're losing old leaves. Evergreen plants do shed periodically. So as they're shedding their old leaves, they still have plenty of new leaves at the tips and plenty of flower buds, but with those light colored varieties, oftentimes those leaves will turn yellow. If you look at this picture down at the bottom, azaleas have a very thin outer bark. And if we go through a roller coaster ride in the winter, where one day it's 80 and the next day it's 20, if that happens, especially as they're breaking dormancy in the spring, sometimes that outer bark will split and we can have some damage and lose some of those branches. These are the southern indica types, and you can see some very large showy flowers. Again, these are not varieties that will overwinter well in the northern tier, but these are going to grow quite large, so give them room to grow both in height and in width. The Encore azaleas are not the only reblooming variety anymore. We now have probably 3 different series from nurseries across the country that have blooms that come on in the spring and then again in the fall. Within the Encore world, they were the first of the rebloomers. There's probably now 25 varieties, and only about a third of those will overwinter in the northern tier. I don't think their blooms are as showy in the spring of the year, but this is the kind of blooms you're going to be seeing in the fall and early winter before a frost. So they can extend that season of flowering for us very nicely. The Encores do need a little bit more sunlight than just a spring-only bloomer, because think about it, they're setting energy throughout the season because they're blooming on both old wood and new wood. If you find out where they're growing down in Alabama and Louisiana, they're out in full sun. Now, these would take full sun in Arkansas, but there's 2 problems with that. One is you're going to have to water tremendously. The other problem can lead back to what I talked about with that splitting of the bark. If they're out in full sun, they're going to go through more extremes in temperature than if they're protected by the hot afternoon sun. And let's think about that. Winter hardiness is affected in Arkansas not by how cold it gets in the winter, but because we do have a lot of variability. We do that hot and cold. And so plants that are on the south or the west side of the house are going to go through more fluctuations because it's going to get hotter on sunny days than if they're on the east or the north side of the house. So if we've got a plant that is marginally hardy, you want to put it on an eastern or northern exposure. If you plant an azalea in deep, deep shade, you're never going to see a flower. They have to have filtered sunlight or morning sunlight at least in order to have the energy to bloom. Now, to grow azaleas successfully, they all need that acidic pH. And you're going to hear about pH of soils, but pH of soils can range from 0 to 14. 7 is neutral, right in the center. Anything below 7 is considered acidic, and anything above 7 is considered alkaline. But pH on azaleas needs to be down really acidic, 5 to 5.5. If you ever see an azalea and the leaves are yellow but the veins are green, that's what we call iron chlorosis. And it doesn't mean you don't have enough iron in the soil, but it's being tied up in the soil because your pH is too high. They also like a very well amended soil. They like organic matter, and many of our soils are lacking in organic matter. Drainage is critical. Azaleas have a very shallow fibrous root system, and if you plant them in an area where the soil is wet, or if you plant them too deep, they're going to smother and they're going to die. So they need well-drained soil, but they also need water. They are not drought-tolerant plants. So if you don't plan to water, do not plan to plant azaleas. Fertilization, I really think that most home gardeners fertilize their shrubs way too much. I think for azaleas, once a year should be sufficient after bloom in the spring. Even if you're growing the reblooming types, once a year in the spring should be sufficient if you've got a good soil for them to grow in. If they're young plants or you're looking for a little bit faster growth, you could do 1 second application 6 to 8 weeks after that first one, but that is it for the year. You know, if you buy a bag of azalea fertilizer and it says fertilize monthly throughout the growing season, remember they're selling fertilizers. Your plants do not need that much nutrition. You know, a lot of times our gardeners are out there fertilizing all the time, and then they're pruning because they're growing too fast. Well, you're sending mixed messages. 1 application a year should suffice for most of our landscape shrubs, and that will be in the spring. The reason we say after bloom, if you fertilize with a nitrogen fertilizer before they flower, you're going to encourage the leaf buds to grow, and that could grow up and actually cover up the blooms. Okay, deciduous azaleas, I think we need to plant more of them. What you lose in foliage, you gain in fragrance. They're a little bit slower growing than our evergreen counterparts. They're a little slower to begin flowering if they've got a brand new plant. It can take up to 3 years before they bloom, but once they start to flower, you should have flowers every year. You'll notice that the flowers are born in clusters, more similar to a rhododendron. They're not an individual bloom, and the flower colors are going to have a little bit larger palette. Pinks and whites are our native azaleas that are deciduous, but you can also get these fabulous yellows and oranges. And let me tell you, they will stop traffic if you've got a plant in full bloom. And the fragrance is just as good as a gardenia. Here's some more. And look at those. They're just lovely flowers and just beautiful. Now, the downside, I think, to all azaleas is that their bloom season is not long. You know, typically 3 to 4 weeks is about the length of time we're going to get flowers on our deciduous azaleas and our evergreen ones as well. Look at the rhododendrons. Now, here's the difference. Rhododendrons tend to be more tree-like, where azaleas are more shrub-like. So the flowers on an azalea are typically born independently, where here in the rhododendrons you see that cluster or ball of blooms. They must have excellent drainage and absolutely no direct afternoon sun. So water, 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 but make sure they do have good drainage. But give them room to grow. Typically the smallest mature rhododendron is 10 to 12 feet tall. So, and they don't tolerate severe pruning well at all. So plant them, site them well, and kind of let them grow. If you travel much, you will see plants like this all over England, all over Rhode Island, up in the north. They're out in full sun, no irrigation, and people think, well, we can do this back in Little Rock or in Arkansas. No, you cannot. This is something that rarely will you even see one this large in the south, simply because they're not going to be as happy in hot, humid conditions. But we do have folks growing them, and that we're getting more and more all the time. Just because we do have a lot of azaleas in our landscapes, we do occasionally have some issues. This is the lace bug. Now, this is a mature insect right here. So you can see that is not a large pest. Here's another one down here, and there's one over here on the side. The little black things you see can be droppings of the insect as well as eggs that they're laying. There typically are 3 to 5 generations a year. They normally start attacking our azaleas in late April or May, depending on the season. They begin their feeding on the undersurface of the leaf. And so the first thing you'll notice is that the upper surface will have some little white specks. If you've allowed them to grow unchecked all season, the entire leaf surface of your plant can be silvery or bronzish, where the sap has been sucked out. Typically, we don't get complaints about these until August when those leaves are bronze, and they'll go, what do we do now? Well, it's too late. By that point, the damage is done. Rarely will a lace bug kill your plant. But if you allow this to happen year after year after year, it can weaken it to where something else can come in, and it sometimes can affect their bloomability as well. So if you have a plant that gets it every year, there are several things you can do. Systemic insecticides like orthene, sprayed early in the spring to stop that beginning explosion of the plants or the insects. Or you can use the systemic insecticide, Bayer Advanced Tree and Shrub Insecticide, or Merit. That's the imidacloprid, and that is an insecticide that you would use once a year after bloom in the spring, and it would give you a full season or two of coverage. And this is what I was talking about earlier, the yellowing of the old leaves. White and light pink varieties often do this, as well as gardenias. When we start to see them in the fall of the year, and people get concerned that the plants are dying. But if you look, you've got plenty of new green leaves here, and the flower buds are still intact, and it's nothing to worry about. If we have a cool, moist spring, azalea leaf gall can be an issue, and it looks absolutely awful, but it really is not deadly at all. When you see it, it starts off, it looks like somebody poured candle wax on the leaves. They'll turn sort of a bright apple green. As they stay on the plant, it will go to more of a grayish color and then eventually white, where the mycelium or the spores are growing. All you need to do is when you see it, go over there, snap it off or prune it out and dispose of it. Don't throw it in the yard. Those spores are actually going to infect the plant for the next year. So if it's cool, wet spring the next year, you'll have it back. If it's not, you won't see it. And once the temperatures get to 80 degrees, it stops completely. Another group of plants that I think we all should be growing more of are camellias. You know, I mentioned that azaleas are only in bloom typically 3 to 4 weeks out of the year. I have the sasanqua and the japonica types of camellias in my yard. Now, sasanquas for me are my favorite, and they will grow statewide. So camellia sasanqua can grow from South Arkansas to the northern tier with no problems. The japonica varieties are going to be Central Arkansas South. They're the ones that are going to bloom a little bit later. But sasanquas start blooming for us in November, and we will have flowers on them typically through January. So a plant that is blooming in a season when we need extra color, in my opinion, is a very good thing. The japonicas typically don't start blooming for us until late January or February, and we'll have blooms into March. Now, sasanquas I would relegate like an azalea. They're more shrub-like, where japonicas are more tree-like. The flowers are much larger on a japonica, just like larger on a rhododendron. So they're going to be showier. But the japonicas can suffer from late frost very easily, where the sasanquas, we can have snow or ice and the open flowers can be damaged. But look at how many buds are still tight on all of these plants. And those flowers will open, so you have a much more extended season of flowering. Typically the same thing on a camellia as an azalea, fertilized once a year. Now we say after bloom. I would not want to be fertilizing a camellia in the dead of winter. So I fertilize my camellias when I fertilize the azaleas. They're going to set their flower buds at the end of the growing season. So typically by August and September, flower buds are set for these. So the key is to do it in the spring of the year when all of our winter weather has passed. If you're growing these larger flowered japonicas, picking up the spent flowers or raking them up can cut down on disease issues, but that's not usually an issue much with the sasanqua varieties. They do prefer to have a little extra water when it's dry, but once they're established, they are much more drought tolerant than an azalea. Now, I said monitor for pests. This is the #1 pest problem on camellias. And you can see this one is pretty well affected. It's a T scale, and the scale insects typically are going to start on the undersurface of the leaf. It looks almost like somebody took salt and pepper and coated that leaf there. What you'll see on the top is a little bit of mottling, and that's where those insects are sucking the sap out again. So if you've got this, a systemic insecticide is really your only recourse, because a contact spray would have to get on the undersurface of every one of those leaves to be effective. So putting out a systemic insecticide in the spring of the year should give you a season or two of control. Okay, let's talk about a few other shrubs then in the landscape. Loropetalums have become quite popular across the South. In northwest Arkansas, in a cold winter, they can experience some damage. So that is a limiting factor up there. The original Loropetalums that hit our market about 10 years ago all got quite large. In fact, this is one that did not read the plant tag in my yard. I got one when it first came out, and it was supposed to get 5 to 6 feet tall, and today it's 19 feet tall. So I just tree formed it. I turned it into something that it wasn't supposed to be. But today the varieties are pretty true to their size. That purple pixie there in the middle, that one looks large, but that's actually coming down from that container. So purple pixie is the smallest and slowest growing. So it's cascading down. That plant only gets about 8 to 10 inches tall, but it's going to be slow as molasses in the garden. That purple diamond will get about 4 to 5 feet in height. And if you don't like the combination of that purplish red foliage with hot pink blooms, which is what the bloom color is on those purple varieties, you can get the green leaf variety called Emerald Snow, and that one has white flowers. Okay, bamboo is one that I would never plant in my garden, but this is called heavenly bamboo. I don't call it that, but this is Nandina. There's a lot of folks that wouldn't plant Nandina in their yard. I happen to like them, but there's a lot of different varieties today. The new varieties are fruitless, which means they don't set flowers and they don't set the berries. So the birds can't eat them and scatter the seeds and cause problems, because they are becoming a bit invasive in some parts of our state. They will tolerate full sun to total shade, as will the Loropetalums. I forgot to mention that. They will tolerate both as well. But this will grow anywhere. The only thing it will not tolerate is wet feet. It's very drought tolerant, but this is a plant that's been grown since the settlers first came to Arkansas. I like the fruits in the winter. During the growing season, the dwarf varieties are just a green blob in the landscape. But where they really shine is in that fall and winter landscape when they turn fire engine red. But plant the dwarf varieties close together. They're short and they're slow growing, and if you give them too much space in between, it's going to look like polka dots out in the landscape. Mahonia is another old-fashioned plant in the garden. Mahonia is also called Oregon grape holly. You can see the yellow flowers up here. This plant blooms in the shade, and it blooms in the winter. So depending on our type of winter, some years it's blooming in January and some years it's blooming in March. But the flowers are fragrant and the bees adore them. And then it has these clusters of sky blue berries that persist into the summer. It does have some pretty good thorns on it, so be careful you don't plant it right next to where you're doing a lot of activity. It's relatively slow growing. It has multiple canes, but it can get some height to it over time. A newer variety is called Soft Caress, and if you look at this one, it is a much smaller growing variety. There's no thorns on it whatsoever, and this plant has the yellow blooms in November. So this plant is blooming in the fall, where these plants, this is a dwarf Mahonia here, Mahonia aquifolium, and that is going to bloom in the winter as well. Glossy abelia, there's a lot of great abelias on the market today. They're evergreen plants that will grow in full sun to partial shade. The standard one just had these small white bell-shaped blooms. The red thing you're seeing is the calyx, or the part that's behind the flower that can persist and give you some color. But the standard one is 6 by 6, and it's okay, but it's not the showiest. Look at some of these newer varieties. Kaleidoscope has yellow, orange, and green foliage. Twist of Lime has that yellow border to the leaf. And if you're looking for a pink flowering form, there's Edward Goucher or Pinky Winky. So these plants will grow in pretty much any condition in your garden. Give them a well-drained soil, but they bloom almost frost to frost. They'll start flowering for me usually late April, early May, and I'll have flowers on it. through a killing frost. And so the bees will have some activity. And then with these variegated plants, they're showy throughout the winter as well. So you can add that color dimension with foliage and flowers here. Now this is a plant that is just going to be a green fill plant for us. If you live in the northern tier of Arkansas, you can actually grow this plant that's called yew or taxus. But we can't grow that plant in central and south Arkansas. This is one looks like a taxus. Cephalotaxus is called the plum yew. And there is this spreading form, which is low growing, usually no more than about 3.5 feet tall, called Utopia. Or if you're looking for something a little bit taller, Fastigiata. And so these are both evergreen plants for deep shade to light sun. And they're just going to be a nice green fill, but they give you a different texture and form with that foliage and do very nicely across the state. So Cephalotaxus will grow statewide, where Taxus, the true yew, will only grow in the northern tier. Clayera, this was the plant that was actually proposed to be the substitute for redtop photinia. If you look at that liane Clayera there, it looks a lot like a redtop photinia. The new growth that comes on a Clayera can be red, it can be bronze, it can be green. Size can vary from mature size at 8 feet up to 15 feet. They're not as fast growing as a redtop photinia, but they can be an evergreen substitute for that as a hedge or as a foundation planting. So they will tolerate full sun to total shade. Some of the newer varieties now have variegated foliage. There's Romeo and there's a Juliet. The Romeo is a little bit larger variety, where the Juliet is a bit smaller, but nice variegated foliage. Elysium or Florida anise. This is a great evergreen shade plant, and it's rare to find plants that bloom well in the shade, and this one does. The native variety, it's native to the southeastern United States, is red. There's also a white flowered form, and the newest one is called Woodlands Ruby with these pink blooms. And this will bloom in late spring, gets 5 to 6 feet in height, more of a narrow growth habit, and both the flowers and the foliage have that anise or kind of licorice scent to them. Junipers. By nature, this is a huge family as well. Look at the plants in these pictures. Both of those are going to be junipers. We've got ground cover forms like blue rug juniper, up to tree forms like the eastern red cedar, which dots our roadsides. That's Juniperus virginiana. So these are plants, again, know what the mature size is. There are more limitations with a needle type evergreen versus a broadleaf evergreen. If you misplant something like a holly in the wrong place, you can prune it and not kill it. But if you're growing a needle type evergreen, there are only green growth buds where there are green needles. So if you prune it severely back, you may do some damage to that branch or that plant because it won't bounce back as quickly as a broadleaf plant. They are very drought tolerant plants. They will not do well in poor drainage. They do well in full sun. They have a few pest problems. One of those is bagworms, the insect that forms the individual little sac around itself. That happens on junipers a lot. And then also spider mites can sometimes be a problem with these. But they are pretty sharp with their needles on the edges, but very tolerant in the landscape. If you're using something like the blue rug or the ground cover junipers, make sure you do an excellent job of weed control before you plant them, because they are not very tolerant to herbicides, and you definitely don't want to be getting in there with a hoe trying to get grass and weeds out. So once you get a nice thorough coverage, that can shade out most of your weed problems, but during establishment, you want that site as clean as possible. Okay, let's talk about some deciduous shrubs now. These are plants that lose their leaves. That's one of those terms. Some of them that bloom in the spring are very showy because all of their flowers come on before the foliage. But some of them have good berries, others do not. And then there are some that actually have good fall color before their leaves fall as well. One of the first of them to bloom is forsythia. Forsythia is a really showy plant provided it is pruned properly and it's getting full sun. The more sunlight this plant gets, the better. There are some new dwarf varieties available, but I think these larger ones work really well. In fact, we see a lot of old home sites in Arkansas that have a hedge that's yellow, pink, and white. The yellow of the forsythia, the pink of the flowering quince, and the white of the bridal wreath spirea. The only downside I would say to these plants is they don't bloom that long. But they're tough performers and old-fashioned plants, and they'll come back year after year after year. Now, this is what we would like to see, nice full yellow flowers. If you look at that plant in the bottom, they've tried to make a meatball out of it. They've taken their electric hedge trimmer and sheared it. And if you look, the stems are getting woodier and woodier and woodier, and they don't produce flowers. So the flowers are born on a forsythia on the growth they put on from the time they bloom in the spring until they set their flower buds in early fall. So you want to do your thinning at the base. Take out 1/3 of those old canes at the bottom every year, and that will start with new growth, and you should have flowers then from top to bottom. If this plant in the bottom were in my yard, I would chainsaw it to the ground and start over. Let the new sprouts come up after, and it will have flowers then the next year. Barberries. The more sunlight they get, the more color they're going to have. There are actually a lot of new varieties. There are crimson barberries with that dark reddish purple foliage, golden barberries with yellow foliage. There are now orange varieties, and there are some green varieties. I think a lot of folks buy these plants in the summer when they're full of leaves and then get concerned in the fall when they start losing those leaves. They're not aware that they're deciduous, but they are. There are standard varieties that can get up to 5 feet tall and 5 feet across. And then there are dwarf varieties that get no taller than 2 feet tall and 2 feet across. Be aware that those plants are covered in thorns. This is what the plant looks like in the winter, not the most attractive, but those stems are solid thorns. So if you have to do much in the way of pruning, that can be an issue. These are some of the new varieties. They're actually producing new varieties. Barberries can grow from Florida to Canada. So it's a versatile plant. And you can see here's one of the new orange varieties here in the bottom. There's some yellow ones. But look at the plant diversity as far as spread and height. So when you're putting something out like this, make sure that you're planting barberries around some some evergreen plants as well, so that you don't look at a bunch of sticks then all winter long. But if you've got an area that's hot and dry, this plant will tolerate it. The burning bush euonymus, it's going to have its best show in the fall of the year. Some people call it fire bush. The leaves turn bright, brilliant red, provided it has plenty of sun. Good fall color on trees as well as shrubs is going to be better if we have plenty of moisture during the late summer and fall, and if we have cool nights but warm days. That's ideal for that color. So there are standard varieties as well as dwarf. During the growing season, it's just a green plant. If you look at the stems on a burning bush, it has that extra little corky tissue there that's called a wing. And if you look at the Latin name, Euonymus alatus. Alatus means wings in Latin. So that's what that extra tissue is. It's nothing wrong with the plant. That's its natural growth habit. Caria japonica, or commonly called the yellow rose of Texas. I call this the forsythia for the shade. This plant does very well in the spring of the year. If there are two basic forms, this one that you're looking at here in this picture is the double flowered form, but there's also the single flowered form. Now, when you compare the two, this one is going to have more flowers per stem than the double flowered form. But this one only blooms once a year, where the double flowered form can bloom off and on 2 or 3 times a year. Even though it is deciduous, the plants have that green stem all throughout the winter, so it does give you a different form and texture even in the dormant winter landscape. A downside to this is that once it gets established, it sometimes gets a little too happy, and you'll get some runners that will take off around the plant. But when that happens, just thin those out, dig them up, share them with your friends. It's a great pass-along plant. The viburnums, you may know snowball bushes. Snowball bushes are viburnums, but there's a lot of plants in this family as well. The double file viburnum could take the place of a dogwood tree in full sun. It could be left as a large bush like you see here, or it can be limbed up with the trunk and kept as a small tree. The double file viburnum typically has beautiful white blooms in the spring, followed by red berries in the middle of summer, and then black berries in the fall. There's no fragrance to this double file viburnum. There is a species called snowflake or summer snowflake, and this one is going to bloom as long as it's putting on new growth. It does not set fruit, but you can get 2 or 3 sets of flowers off of it. The more sunlight you get, the better they'll flower. They will tolerate partial shade as well. Now here are 2 that are highly fragrant, the Judei and the Birkwood. And if you look at these 2 here on the left, this one is growing in full sun. This one is growing in quite a bit of shade down at Garvin Gardens in Hot Springs. They still have a lot of flowers on them, but you'll see this plant is a little bit more open because of the lack of sunlight. The Judei here is growing in full sun, and look at the flowers on it. If you have room for a deciduous hedge, they are stunning. They smell as sweet as gardenias, but they are dormant or deciduous in the winter. The hydrangeas, lots and lots and lots of varieties of hydrangeas. Now, those of you in the northern tier of Arkansas tend to struggle with blooms on these because this is not one of our smartest plants. The big leaf hydrangea, Hydrangea macrophylla, it blooms in the summer, but it sets flower buds in the fall. So if we have a day or 2 of warm weather in January or February, it thinks spring has sprung and it starts to grow and it can get winter damage. This is the only plant I do know that you can change the color of the flowers by changing the pH of the soil. So in acidic soils, they're going to be blue. In alkaline soils, they're going to be pink. So we have people that put lime on one side and sulfur on the other to get a 2-tone plant, but the intensity of the color will be based on the variety of the plant. And you can see this is a mop head kind of bloom, where this is a lace cap type of bloom. There's those buds that start growing in the dead of winter when they start to show color like this. If we do get a hard freeze, it will kill it. This is where the top bud on each of these stalks is where the largest flower is going to be. If they get frozen back, there are some buds further down that can still bloom, but they won't be as large. It is not the most attractive plant in the dead of winter. It kind of looks like dead sticks, but those dead sticks contain the flowers. So you've got a very short window of opportunity to prune, which is after they bloom in the summer. But if you prune during the dead of winter, you're cutting your flowers off. Now, there are some varieties now, especially for the northern tier. If you're going to grow the Hydrangea macrophylla, the big-leafed hydrangea, I would grow these. Endless Summer, Blushing Bride, and there's 10 more now. Penny Mac, Lady in Red, several of those. These are called remontant, which is a fancy word for reblooming. They bloom on the new growth as well as the old growth. So even if they freeze to the ground in the winter, they still will have flowers on the new growth throughout the summer. Plant these hydrangeas where they get morning sun or filtered sun, no direct sunlight in the afternoon, and they need plenty of water. They are not drought tolerant plants. In fact, they'll wilt every day in the summer when the temperatures get hot. The oak leaf hydrangeas are similar to the big leaf hydrangea in that they bloom in the summer and set flower buds in the fall, but they are much more winter hardy. So rarely will we lose the blooms to a late frost. So they will start growing. You can see the very coarse textured foliage, beautiful panicles of white flowers. As those white flowers age, they turn sort of a dusty rose or tan color. And then the fall foliage is stunning with bright reds and burgundies. And that leaf color can persist. Size. This is a standard variety that can get up to 10 feet tall. And you can see that plant's easily 10 to 15 feet across. But there are dwarf varieties as well. Okay, Hydrangea paniculata, or the panicle or PG hydrangea. This is where we're really pushing a lot of folks to start trying these. They're much more forgiving than the big leaf hydrangeas. The flowers people think are not quite as showy because they're not pink and blue. Most of them are white. There are some that have some pink coloration to them now. You can see the light pink there in Pinky Winky. But the panicle hydrangeas bloom on the new growth. So it doesn't matter what kind of winter we have. They will produce the flowers on that current season. They can grow in full sun to partial shade, and they don't wilt every day. So in my opinion, if I'm putting in way more of the panicle types now than I am the big leaf varieties, and we're getting a lot of new varieties to choose from every year. So there's the panicle there on the left. The other variety we're looking at is the hydrangea arborescens, or the smooth hydrangeas. The first of those was Annabelle, and now there are several new varieties of those as well. Both of these varieties can be pruned as much or as little as you like before growth begins, because they do bloom on the new growth. The panicles will take more sun. The arborescens need similar conditions to the big leaf: morning sun, afternoon shade. And there's the Annabelle, that big mop head kind of bloom. There's now Invincibelle and Invincibelle Spirit. If you get garden catalogs, you may see some that show blooms that are ginormous. That's not going to happen. The flowers are going to be more the size that you see here. But they still can be very showy, and they bloom in the summer up until early fall. Althea, or Rose of Sharon, a very old-fashioned plant in our garden, and it's made a strong comeback. You know, the old-fashioned varieties, every flower set a seed, and I think a lot of those seeds germinated. These new varieties are what's called self-cleaning. The flowers fall off and new ones replace them, so they can start blooming for us in June, and we can still have flowers on them in the fall. They do well in full sun to partial shade. Flower colors can be pinks, purples, whites, apricots. There are single blooms and double blooms. Tough performer in the garden, but it is deciduous. And then the spireas. There's a lot of different spireas. You need to know if you're growing the spring bloomers like bridal wreath, or if you're growing the summer bloomers. And we have room for both. In my opinion, the bridal wreath, again, is pretty short bloomed, but it's a tough performer. Has nice white flowers, and look at the delicate foliage. So that very soft texture in the summer during the growing season is a nice thing to see as well. But you can see how small the blooms are, and they're borne independently along that stem. This one makes a little bit stronger impact. It's the Van Hoot spirea, and instead of the individual blooms, we have a cluster of flowers, so it is a little bit more dramatic or showy. But the ones I grow more of are these summer blooming spireas. There's Anthony Waterer that forms a little bit stronger bush. I love the Little Princess, but there's, again, a lot of new varieties. Flower colors can be pink, purple, white. There's even a red flowering variety now. Prune these hard before growth begins in the spring, and as long as they're putting on new growth, they are flowering pretty much all summer, and the butterflies and the bees adore them. So you can see just some of the different varieties here. If you like the yellow foliaged forms, there's Gold Mound, there's Lime Mound. I'm not a huge fan of yellow and pink, so that's why I don't like the Gold Mound as well, because I think the yellow foliage with the pink flowers, but it still gives you a lot of color. Try some of these new varieties of spireas. They're really, Double Play series has a pink one, a white one, a purple one, and a red variety. So very tough plants, no disease or insect problems, and could be a lot of color in your summer landscape. But again, they need to be planted around something evergreen, because they're not going to be that showy in the dead of winter.